Ačiū Eligijau už tokią žaismingą pristatymą ir ačiū visiems, kad atėjote mane paklausyti. O dabar aš pereisiu į anglų kalbą, nes šita knyga yra parašyta angliškai. Kitos mano knygos yra parašytos lietuviškai, o šita angliškai. So, Vanished Lands, dvitaškis, Memory and Post-Memory in North American Lithuanian Diaspora Literature. This is an academic monograph, so it's a little different than some of the other nonfiction and fiction books that I've written in the past. It was published by Peter Lang International Publishers in the United Kingdom, which is, I feel, a breakthrough for me as a writer, but also a breakthrough for Lithuanian writers and the Lithuanian story in general, because this is one of the first books about a very narrow and specific topic, which is basically us, the North American Lithuanian diaspora, which is published by a major international publisher and made available to readers all over the world. So our story, which has been so personal, and which really in settings like this one that we're in right now, here at Ateitis this week, very intimate community settings, is now opening up and spreading out into the world. Okay, so, I just want to say a few words about the cover to the book, because the cover this is a historical photograph, but it's also a very personal photograph. On the cover here to what would be my far right, this is my grandmother, Janina Čiurlytė Simutienė, as a young woman in her late 20s, early 30s, and she was working as a social worker for the American Federation of International Institutes, which was one of the organizations that greeted displaced persons coming into New York Harbor after World War II and helped place them in jobs and find housing. To the far left is her colleague and family friend, Werner Wartenberg, who was a Jewish Holocaust survivor, a German Jew who lost his entire family in the Holocaust. And in fact, my mother, who's sitting in the audience, remembers that my grandparents would invite him over for Sunday afternoon dinners and to play games and just spend some time with the family. So here you have two people who lost family members and were separated from family members as a result of Stalin and Hitler, and as a result of World War II, but who, working for the American organization AFII, were able to help others. And I think this photograph, and these are two displaced persons, but they're not identified on the photograph. But this photograph really typifies two parts of this book. So one part is the story of Lithuanian displaced persons and their descendants, and the other part of this story is Lithuanian Jewish displaced persons and their descendants, and that will be more clear as we go along. As you could see, it's a pretty thick book, and this presentation will last from 45 minutes to an hour, depending on if I see any of you nodding off or glazing over, and then I'll just kind of rush it to the end. I do want to leave about 15 minutes for discussion and questions, but there's a lot of themes to cover, so I'm going to try to cover as much as possible. And I really hope that as I'm talking about these different themes, that you reflect on your own family stories, because this is very much a book about our story and our experiences. Okay. So, why is the title Vanished Lands? So now when you get an offer from a prestigious publisher to publish a book, your biggest challenge is to come up with a good title. And I thought about it for a long time. And I came up with the title Vanished Lands, and I asked a few friends what they thought, and one of my friends said to me, "Oh, people are going to think it's a book about global warming and about and about the countries that are sinking into the Pacific. But no, the vanished lands, to me the vanished lands were Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and the other countries that were swallowed up into the Soviet Union and into the Eastern Bloc after World War II. And as you could see on this map, all right, is that the map shows Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia absorbed into the Soviet Union. As you could see, there is no delineation outlining Latvia or Lithuania or Estonia, okay? So, who wants to take a guess? We'll do a little survey here. Raise your hand if you think this map was produced by the Soviet Union. Nobody? Yeah? Raise your hand if you think it's an American map. Ah, you guys are smart. It's an American map. And I'll tell you, this is a very interesting thing. It's a game that the Soviets were playing, that inside Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and the other occupied countries, they produced maps that kind of had dotted lines around the countries, showing you are our brotherly republics, we're all good friends here, which gave the illusion that Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia had some semblance of cultural and political agency, which in fact they did not have. But in the United States, the maps did not show any delineation, and so therefore, for all of us, and I know this was my experience growing up, any map of the world did not include Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, okay? So what I found, actually this book grew out of my dissertation research at Vilnius University, and I pretty much read every book published in English written by a North American writer of Lithuanian descent, and I was looking for themes that pull all these works of literature together, and one of the predominant themes was this question of the map and the lands that had vanished, the lands that no longer existed on the maps. And so here you see a map that does show Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. And the interesting thing is, I teach at the University of Southern Maine, and we have the Osher Maps Library. And I worked with one of the maps librarians going through 20th century maps of the former Soviet Union and Lithuania, and we found this to be consistently true, that maps published in the United States and Canada and elsewhere did not show those pre-war borders. Okay, so, but this is something that also affected the psyches of writers as they were growing up. So actually, I'd like to read to you an excerpt from Daiva Markelis' memoir, White Field, Black Sheep, A Lithuanian-American Life. And she writes, depending on the politics of the map maker, Lithuania was either on the map, its borders penciled in with dashes, lines less certain than those outlining France or Turkey, with the word Lithuania squeezed in, or sometimes, oh so wonderfully, Lietuva, the Lithuanian spelling. Or it was missing, absent, obliterated by a large pink smear of color, the USSR. Okay, so this is theme, I'm giving you this example, but really the issue of the map, Lithuania having vanished off the map is one that comes up in the work of Antanas Šileika. I know years before I wrote this book, it was something that came up in my own writing, because having been vanished off the map means that your cultural identity, your sense of identity is also vanished. And so, you know, a lot of writers have reflected on how do you build a sense of cultural identity when you can't prove that you come from a country that's on a map, okay? So this was very much our Cold War experience. Okay, so an ocean away and a century in the past. Since Lithuania's period of national rebirth in the late 1980s, almost 100 works of literature written in English by North American writers of Lithuanian descent have been published by commercial and university presses in the United States and Canada. These works of literature include fiction, memoir, literary nonfiction, essays, collections of poetry, and drama. Thematically, these works of literature are mostly concerned with cultural and historical trauma that has affected Lithuania, ranging from events such as the 19th century efforts of Tsarist authorities to Russify the Lithuanian population, the first and second Soviet occupations, and related violence, deportations, and resistance, the plight of displaced persons and immigration, and the Nazi occupation and Holocaust in Lithuania. Additionally, these essays, memoirs, historical novels, autobiographical novels, literary fiction, short stories, and drama mostly engage with and reflect on collective, public, shared cultural memory events, such as the reinstatement of Lithuania's independence in 1990, immigration, the culture of the North American Lithuanian diaspora communities, and right of return journeys to Soviet and post-Soviet Lithuania. This group's writing explores familial and individual trauma, silence, secrets, right of return, cultural memory, and haunt memory. Essentially, much of this writing is post-memory writing. Now, I know that I just hit you with a lot of new terminology here, but I will be going into that terminology. But what really intrigued me was that when I really looked at, it's now more than 100 books have been published at this point. But what I found was when I started putting together a bibliography of writing in English published in North America by writers of Lithuanian descent, overwhelmingly the subject matter of those books was cultural and historical trauma that took place in Lithuania. So that means the Holocaust, that means the Soviet occupation, deportations to Siberia. And these books are written by writers who were born in the United States and Canada, all right? And some of them hadn't even visited Lithuania. So the question is, why are they choosing to write about these topics? And that's what I wanted to figure out when I was writing this book. So why are these writers concerned with a past that has vanished? Okay, that's the big question here. So the memoirs, in this book, I have to limit myself to analyzing 6 memoirs, although I do bring in plays and poetry and short stories, but the focus is mostly on memoir. So the memoirs I analyze in Vanished Lands are thematically linked through reflections on family, community, society, and the individual's place within these social constructs. So I raise the question as to why so many memoirs, novels, works of literary nonfiction, poems, and plays written by second and third generation descendants of Lithuanian displaced persons and immigrants predominantly explore post-memory topics relevant to collective memory and collective trauma in the North American Lithuanian diaspora community and/or the North American Lithuanian Jewish community. Okay, so really, very often the answer lies with family stories, with writers absorbing these stories through their own family histories, or if they are far enough removed from that family history, seeking to learn more and to uncover the family stories that were not shared with them. Okay. So, for me, an inspiration of really digging into family stories start with my grandparents in this lovely photo here from 1936. They're on an ocean liner headed for New York, 18 and 26 years old, newlyweds, where my grandfather has just received a posting in the Consulate General of New York. So at the height of the Great Depression, my grandparents, Anicetas Simutis and Janina Čiulytė Simutienė, arrived in New York by ocean steamer. My grandfather was a young diplomat in Lithuania's Ministry of Foreign Affairs and was posted to Lithuania's Consulate General in New York. The assignment was for 3 years, and the young couple, who were 26 and 18, were scheduled to return to Lithuania in 1939. My grandmother did not like New York and could hardly wait to return to Kaunas. They could not have imagined at that time that they would not return home for over half a century, not until Lithuania became independent again in 1991. They could not imagine that the Lithuania they had grown up in a fledgling democracy, would become a vanished land, erased from the map of the world, occupied and absorbed into the Soviet Union. So part of that answer to that question I found, why are these writers preoccupied with telling these stories, has to do with having absorbed the trauma and the longing and the homesickness of parents and grandparents through those family stories. So here's my great-grandparents who were displaced persons. Okay, so after she left Lithuania in 1936, my grandmother did not reconnect with her parents and younger sister for 10 years. As intellectuals, my great-grandmother, Elena Bilminute-Ciuliana, who was a concert pianist, trained in St. Petersburg, and my great-grandfather, Jurgis Čiurlys, who was an engineer, educated in St. Petersburg, and who served in the Ministry of Transportation, they were on the deportation list to Siberia, and they escaped as DPs first to Austria. Okay. All right, so let's talk a little bit about memory as catalyst for memoir. So I shared a little bit about my family story, which really inspires me as a researcher to learn more about other people's family stories and to really look at family stories not just within the context of like the small microcosm of the family, but what that means in a larger cultural and community context. So here are 2 quotes from 2 of the writers whose memoirs I analyzed. So in an interview with Samuel Bach, Samuel says, "My memoir is closely related to my paintings. I did not write with the self-consciousness that the professional writer has. I desired to bring back to life something that I knew existed in my memory." So Samuel Bach's memoir, Painted in Words, which is really one of the most beautiful memoirs I've ever read, it's his memoir of surviving the Holocaust in Vilnius together with his mother. His father dies, his 4 grandparents are killed, his entire extended family is lost, and only he and his mother and an aunt and a cousin survive. So he tells that story, but he begins by telling the story of this very beautiful childhood he had in Vilnius until age 9, and then how they survive the Holocaust, and later how he becomes a painter. But when I sat down in his home to talk to him about the memoir, he shared with me that his deep motivation was that all he knew of this large extended family, he knew through the stories his mother told him. And so his motivation for writing his memoir was to put those stories down on paper before they were lost, to recreate the family that had been lost. Okay, Antanas Šileika, in an essay, European Homelands of the Imagination, writes, "If I sat in the kitchen with my mother and father as they were drinking tea after dinner, and if they were not rushed, they might tell me the story of their last home in the Lithuanian city of Ateitis, which they had fled in the summer of 1944. So Samuel Bach is writing a memoir remembering his own childhood and his experiences, but also at the same time post-memory, because part of his memoir goes into recreating the life stories of his grandparents, aunts and uncles and other family members. Antanas Šileika, who's born in Canada, grows up in Canada, is writing a post-memory account in European homelands because he's recreating a lost memory that was shared from his parents in conversation. So that is post-memory. So which brings me to the theoretical overview. So I'd like to go over some of the terms that I'm using so that you can really have a better understanding of what I'm talking about. This wonderful photograph is by Antana Singelavičius, who a Kaunas photographer. And this is like a candid moment, this newspaper boy. But I want you to notice, if you could see the newspapers that he's selling, you're going to see Lithuanian, Polish, French, Russian, German magazines and newspapers. That's the reason why I included this photograph, was to show what a multicultural hub of culture and language Kaunas and Lithuania was in the pre-war years. It's documented somewhat accidentally in this photograph. Okay, so let's talk about post-memory. If you're getting bored, you could give me a wave and I'll go faster through the theory, but okay. So post-memory is a preoccupation with the collective, familial, individual trauma of a previous generation to the point that the experiences of previous generations become memories in their own right, creating a deep personal connection of memory, notwithstanding generational distance. Okay, so you have to understand that post-memory means that if the first generation, we talk about the first generation, that means the people who lived through historical trauma collectively as a group, so that that trauma could have been fleeing Lithuania ahead of the Soviet army and all the experiences that they had. It could be living through World War II, it could be deportation to Siberia, it could be Soviet occupation, it could be the Nazi occupation, it could be concentration camps. That's the first generation. But what happens with post-memory is that the children and the grandchildren born into these families absorb those memories, and those memories in their mind overpower their own rites of passage in their own lifetimes. So the types of events that would be important to any individual, graduation, marriage, those rites of passage are overshadowed by these very powerful historical memories of the previous generation, to the point that they kind of wash out your personal history. That is post-memory. Post-memory was first developed by Marianne Hirsch to describe a preoccupation with the collective historical trauma of the Holocaust experienced by the second and third generation born to Holocaust survivors. What Hirsch found was, regardless of country, political system, so many factors, children and grandchildren of Holocaust survivors had that same experience of post-memory. So she saw that it was not connected to where you lived or where you grew up, but to how the events that your older generation in the family experienced and how they were passed on. In recent decades, post-memory has been applied to the analysis of memoirs of collective trauma other than the Holocaust. And in fact, Marianne Hirsch encourages applying post-memory to other cultural events. Okay, so I want to give an example from Yulia Shukis's memoir, Siberian Exile, Blood War and a Granddaughter's Reckoning, about her experience of post-memory. So Yulia writes, "Every family tells its children the story of who it is. Our story was of a proud people forced from their homeland when the soldiers came. They took my father's mother and shipped her east of the Ural Mountains alone. They took her by mistake. It was all a mistake, or so the story went. Her husband, Anthony, had been the target. He had escaped to the safety of the West by luck and through cunning with his children. Our job as kids was to learn this story and remember it, to master our grandparents' language so that one day we might return home from exile. The first problem in taking on this latter task was that we had never seen this home to which we were to repatriate. The second was that the story we'd been told wasn't strictly true. Important pieces of it, the complicated bits that made it hard to narrate, had fallen away." Okay, so in her memoir, she writes about how she set out first to write a memoir about her grandmother who had been exiled to Siberia, and while doing research about her grandmother, she discovers that her grandfather had served as a Lithuanian police officer actually higher than an officer. I believe he was a chief of police in Naujamiestis, and that he had signed off on the murders of Jews in that area, and this came as a tremendous blow to her personally. And so really these are the themes that she explores in her memoir, but she's really saying that she grew up being told a story, and told this story in a certain way, but when she finds out the parts of that story that are more difficult to live with, that really what happens to your sense of identity when this happens to you. So that's one example of post-memory. Here's an excerpt from Rita Gabus's memoir, A Guest at the Shooter's Banquet, My Grandfather's SS Past, My Jewish Family, A Search for the Truth. So her grandfather was a chief of police in Švenčionys and was signed off on the murders of Jewish people and also Polish people in the area. And her father was Jewish, so she has a very complicated family background. So she writes, "It's a prism. It belongs to anybody who wants it. It even belongs to people like me who for many years hated to pronounce its name. Not because I had any special empirical knowledge of Lithuania. I had the lullabies my mother sang to me so I'd sleep, and the stories she told me that kept me from sleep. The ones about war, the ones about the potatoes that made her fat in the displaced persons camp." So you see this, here's an American-born woman who really has very little knowledge of Lithuania, but her only way of piecing together her Lithuanian identity is through stories and songs and the emotion in the family. Daiva Markelis writes, "My mother taught me how to make birds, graceful cranes, from little pieces of paper. She taught me to recite from memory with perfect Lithuanian precision all 12 verses of the children's classic Meškiukas Rudnosiukas when I was only 3. All right, so this is this early childhood Lithuanian education that she's receiving in her family while growing up in Cicero. Okay, Julia Šukys writes, "Not everyone lives this way, so tethered to the past. What would a life untethered look like, I wonder? A life in which the only place I am from is the place I happen to be. Would it be a better way to live, less painful? Is it even possible to make such a choice?" Okay, so you see from these different reflections on post-memory, really what this thinking is, about living this type of double life where you're trying to live your own life and your own destiny, but you're carrying the memory of the historical trauma of the previous generations. So my post-memory disclaimer. So when examining the emotional aspects of post-memory in literature, it's important to recognize that post-memory is not the actual memory of the people who experienced the trauma. As such, post-memory, like first-hand memory, is subjective. However, post-memory reimagines the experiences, which are often traumatic, of generations who lived in the past within the context of history. Therefore, post-memory narratives may vary from the memories of first-hand witnesses. Also, the conclusion that the second and third generation draws through post-memory encounters, research, and right of return experiences may differ from those of their ancestors who actually lived through the collective trauma. So you have this generational break. Quite typically, the second and third generation, because of the nature of war and displacement and the lives of refugees, typically And I'm not just talking about the Baltic experience. Take any historical trauma experience of the 20th and 21st century. You have a second and a third generation who are born and grow up in a different country, speaking a different language, living in a different culture. But they have these stories of historical trauma that they're curious about, they want to learn more about. So there's this cultural disconnect. And so when you're reading post-memory, it's important to not think, well, you're reading word for word history. Although on the other hand, I do have to say that many of the post-memory memoirs, and especially the ones that I wrote about, are very highly researched and are very thoroughly researched, and really do give a sense of the actual history as it took place. So it's a both and, all right? You always have to think about how some of these experiences are filtered through memory and reinterpretation. Okay, so very important aspect of post-memory as established by Marianne Hirsch is the right of return. And every single memoir that I talk about in Vanished Lands has a right of return narrative. And I would venture to guess, myself included, that many of us in this room have gone on our own right of return journeys back to Lithuania. So right of return describes the trauma-laden journeys of return in which the children and grandchildren of former refugees and concentration camp victims visit their parents' and grandparents' homelands seeking answers about family narratives and identity. Narrating and reflecting on the right of return journey has become an integral feature of the post-memory memoir since the collapse of the Soviet Union has made the vanished lands of Eastern Europe accessible to Western travelers. And indeed, of the 6 memoirs that I analyze in this book, really the structure of the memoir is centered around that right of return journey. Okay? So, just to give some examples, having been expelled out of the cultural and historical context of Lithuania as a Jew during the German occupation, in 2001, Samuel Bach is welcomed back into an independent democratic Lithuania's historical and cultural narrative as an honored guest. He makes that right of return. What he writes in his memoir is, I did not travel to Vilnius to rekindle the memory of past horrors. These are, and they must remain, part of my being. What I feared was that this pain would block my access to new experience, but my fear proved ungrounded. Samuel Bach went on to have a huge retrospective show of his artwork in 2001, and then he helped establish the Samuel Bach Museum, which continually has shows of his work from different time periods as an artist, and he's made very generous donations to that museum. And he is constantly, even though he's 91 years old, he's constantly asked to participate in Zoom classes and lectures and discussions with school groups and with Ukrainian refugee groups in Lithuania. So he's very active on Lithuania's behalf. So second generation Lithuanian-Canadian writer Antanas Šileika reflects on his right of return journeys to Lithuania in his memoir, The Barefoot Bingo Caller. He writes, so why this ongoing return to Lithuania, a land of rolling green hills so similar to southern Ontario? For one thing, the stories here in the old country were more brutal, the takes so much higher than back in Canada. Placed beside the gulag, suburban angst is pitiful. All right, so he's looking for the stories, right? Okay, so collective memory. So collective memory refers to memories shared by a community, society, ethnic group, or nation. So after World War II, Lithuanian DPs faced the challenges of building a new life, often without access to the tools to heal from collective trauma, such as psychotherapy or counseling. The diaspora community created its own rituals of remembrance by marking important historic dates in pre-war Lithuania and building strong communities with their own churches, schools, clubs, camps, etc. So you could say that right now here at Ateitis this week, we are experiencing a collective memory event together. Okay, and it's also, you would also say that this is an experience of post-traumatic growth, post-traumatic healing, where a community comes through intergenerational trauma that finds unity and community and in positive community building work. Okay, so just some interludes here. This is, these are Lithuanian DP camp teachers, 1949. It's a graduation ceremony, so they're dressed in their national costumes, which people were fleeing the Soviet army, but they managed to pack their Lithuanian national costume and take it with them because that was a very treasured item. So this is the DP camp teachers was a very strong element of collective memory and post-traumatic growth. So the formative texts of the North American Lithuanian diaspora, such as the Saturday school primers, emigre newspapers and journals, the patriotic literary texts of the first generation, were attempts to socialize younger generations born into the diaspora to the cultural values established by the first generation. For the most part, these texts reveal that Lithuanian diaspora cultural memory is constructed from a romanticized memory of interwar Lithuania as an idyllic agrarian society consisting solely of ethnic Christian Lithuanians, excluding the populous Jewish shtetls and the minority of Russians, Germans, and Poles living within Lithuania. So there's this idea in cultural memory, which was developed by Jan Assmann, that who belongs to the group and who does not belong to the group, and that's part of establishing collective memory. All right, another concept is that of haunt memory, which I think is very important when looking at these books. It was developed by the literary scholars, German literary scholar Gabriel Schwab, Ross Chambers, Nicholas Abraham, Maria Tarek, to explain the sense of being haunted by violent memories from the past that were committed by one's predecessors. The hauntings of the survivor and the perpetrator are recreated through narratives as a secondary trauma experience. Dreams and the power of the imagination are key features of haunt memory. Haunt memory appears in a literary text or post-memory text in ghostly form. The concreteness of the event and its specific details is absent, but the traumatic sense of the event remains. This is a very interesting aspect of these memoirs of post-memory in general, is this haunt memory, these dreams, imaginings, a sense of hauntedness. It's connected with survivor's guilt. It's connected with maybe some knowledge of crimes committed by one's predecessors that are not really out in the open. So a good example comes from Rita Gabus's Guest to the Shooter's Banquet. So she opens her book by describing two dreams that have haunted her throughout her life. And in one of the dreams, she is the hunted, and in the other dream, she is the murderer. So here's the first dream. I'm being hunted down, whoever is after me, and the reasons for their pursuit aren't clear. I know they carry rifles. I know they have an instinct about small places, shelves with false backs that open into alcoves, shadows behind bulky furniture. They know where to look. They know how to listen for my frightened breathing. In the dream, my sense of the hunters is that they are methodical, zealous, unstoppable. They are after me. It's a fact. Usually it's night. I'm barefoot. Footsteps, heavy, slow at first and then louder, faster, clamor of voices, a sweep of light. I close my eyes, try to make myself invisible. My tongue sticks to the roof of my mouth, the spit sucked away by panic. The dream is one of the earliest I remember from childhood. I had it for years. Often, in those days, my hiding place in my dream was my own house on Greenway Terrace in Kansas City. House of our cat Mitzi, house with the doorway from which my grandmother called me in at dusk in her broken English. What was Lithuania to me then? It was a rag wrapped around my mother's tongue, the dark bread of the embarrassing sandwiches she gave my sister and me to take to school, the crust hard as the curb of a road, the meat inside an uneven slab. I wanted a white lunch. I wanted to sleep without dreaming. Okay, so here she's describing these dreams of being chased and haunted that relate to her mother's traumatic childhood as a displaced person. So here's her second dream. I'm a murderer. It's not clear who my victim was. It's also not clear that there is just one. I've buried whoever I've killed. I had help. There was planning involved in the placement of the graves. Often my dead are buried near a construction site, a place where concrete will be poured, where floors will be laid, where the dogs, Lassie and Rin Tin Tin, because again, this dream began in childhood, will sniff and paw at the ground, at the just laid turf, at the stone steps and the hedge of fresh ground around the foundation. The dogs alert only to the ordinary, leaves, bits of gravel, the clanging of a copper gutter, the evidence of recent rain. In the dream, I've forgotten the reason for the killing. I just know that I've done it, and the knowledge folds over and over inside me like one of those combines in the fields outside the city in Kansas where my mother's brother and his wife had a farm, where my Lithuanian Catholic grandfather lived the last years of his life. The steel teeth rend me, guilt I'll call it later, when I dream the dream in my 20s and wake trembling because this time the dogs and the detectives are pulling down wallboard, bringing the heavy machinery in to break in the truth, dislodge it. So in her memoir, she really traces how she had a very close relationship with her Lithuanian grandfather, who was a displaced person who she identified with. And late in life, in her mid-40s, she learned from her mother that, in fact, he had been the chief of police serving the Nazi occupiers in Švenčionys, but that he had also personally signed off on a number of killings, including the killings of 500 innocent Polish men who were rounded up and killed in revenge for an assassination attempt on some German officers. And all of this was hidden from her. And she eventually finds the documents and the evidence and the proof, and she has a sense that she had been living with this knowledge without really knowing it. So these are very complex texts and very complex emotions. Okay, let's see. These are exiles to Siberia. I don't know why I keep getting that. Okay, some of the emigre writers. All right, so just one more, trauma theory. So PTSD in the 1970s after the Vietnam War is recognized as an authentic mental illness. So trauma theory is preoccupied with the effects of trauma and the symptoms of trauma on the individual and the traumatized culture as it is expressed in a written text. All right, so you need to differentiate. We're not psychoanalyzing the writer with trauma theory. We're really applying the tools of psychology to the written text, okay? Like those two dream memoirs that I just read to you. So trauma theory is clustered under the umbrella of psychoanalytical criticism, and it's an interdisciplinary area of Western scholarship that melds the disciplines of psychology and the humanities. So you're bringing the science of psychology together with the humanities, together with literary analysis. So trauma theory borrows from sociology and psychology and history. So it's concerned with how traumatic experiences affect and shape literature through the representation of traumatic experience in memoirs and literary narratives. So this is another one of the theories that I apply to these works. Okay, so trauma was never recognized and acknowledged in the DP communities and in the diaspora, mainly because people had to get on with their lives and to survive. People were in survival mode. At the same time, survivor's guilt was prevalent among survivors because it was believed that those left behind in Soviet-occupied Lithuania And those exiled to Siberia had it far worse. There was a lot of longing and concern for those who had been left behind. So these unresolved traumas were passed on to subsequent generations. These traumas are explored in the memoirs and prose and poetry of the second and third generation. Okay, another map. This is a map of the DP camps in Germany, and it was created by Joseph Vincent Denis. And I just wanted to share some photos of DPs and DP life. This is the writer Algirdas Landsbergis, who's coming into New York Harbor as a young DP in his early 20s. Another aspect of the North American Lithuanian diaspora experience that's very little researched or spoken about was that the first DPs were allowed to emigrate to Canada, but they were allowed to go to Canada only as farm workers or to work on projects such as hydroelectric dams or in forestry. So these were typically single men without families. Also, many of these men were the same men who had been forcibly taken by the Germans during the Nazi occupation as very young men, as teenagers, and sent to Germany to work as forced laborers. So now they are, in a way, indentured servants. So they really formed the foundation of the Lithuanian diaspora in Canada. So these are some photos from the Balaišis family album that were shared with me. Okay. So just a little bit about an American cultural identity and early 20th century viewpoint. So how is it that we got to hold on to our Lithuanian identity for so many generations here in the United States rather than being really forced to completely assimilate and lose our identity? And really a lot of this has to do with the work of a social worker, a visionary social worker named Edith Bramer, and her organization AFII, American Federal Institute. So we'll go back to that in a minute. So in the early 20th century, there were three basic viewpoints on cultural identity. All right, because America, country of immigrants constantly coming in. We have the quota system. Later, after World War II, we have displaced persons coming in from Europe. So one of the theories was the first one here, which is Anglo-conformity. So that was the nativist demand that immigrants abandon their traditions and backgrounds and conform to the dominant WASP culture. So it's a little bit like immigration in France to this day. In France, once you immigrate to France, no matter what race you are, no matter what ethnicity, you're considered French, you learn French, you integrate into that culture. And actually there's a very good film, a Lithuanian film that came out last year. Some of you might have seen it at the Baltic Film Festival in Boston about two Lithuanian children who are adopted into a French family and, and how these children are forced to assimilate. Okay, so the other idea is the melting pot, the idea that the best elements of different ethnic cultures would be fused into a newer and stronger American ideal. So then you're a little bit Irish, a little bit Italian, a little bit Norwegian, and you create this new American identity. And then we get cultural pluralism, which is the belief that ethnic groups should maintain their identities and preserve their traditions and cultures, and that such pluralism made for a healthier democratic society. So up until about the 1930s, the two predominant ideas were Anglo-conformity and the melting pot, all right? And that's why when you look at the first wave of Lithuanian immigrants before World War II, in the early 20th century, you'll find that maintaining the Lithuanian language was not a priority in those communities. They had the Lithuanian church, they had Lithuanian club, but really beyond, having a Kugelis party, there wasn't a big emphasis on maintaining language and culture because these people came to America at a time where They went to school and they were told, you must conform, you must forget your native language. All right, so that brings me to Bramer's vision of cultural plurality in America. How are you guys doing? Are you still with me? Are you? Okay, great, okay. So this is what I found very interesting in my research, and really I found this by remember the cover photograph, the sign AFII, American Federation of International Institutes? Well, I was very curious, well, what was that? Who were they? What was that? And so I started doing some research, and I came across a few articles from the early 20th century that explained who was Edith Bramer and AFII, and it was very fascinating to me because this organization and her vision of cultural plurality has a direct impact on us to this day, that we can live in America and in Canada and maintain a dual cultural identity without any kind of cultural conflict. So the biculturality and pluralism that I and many of my generation of American-born second and third generation Lithuanian Americans grew up with was something we took for granted of part of what it meant to be American. When I began researching the work of the United Nations Relief and Renovation Administration, known as UNRWA, and AFII, I realized how much we owed to early visionaries like the 20th century social worker Edith Terry Bramer for the privilege of a dual cultural identity. So in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when immigrants poured into ports from all over Europe, China, and elsewhere, the prevailing ideology regarding immigrants was that of the melting pot. Unique to AFII was Bramer's vision of cultural plurality. Bramer wrote, "There is no richer material for cultural growth than that which can be saved for the foreigner out of his own inheritance." Okay, so Bramer, for example, was one of the first organizers of international folk dance festivals in the United States, of international culinary festivals. She hired social workers who came from immigrant communities and sent them into those communities to work with people. So she would send a Chinese-born Mandarin speaker into a Chinese immigrant community, or a Lithuanian into a Lithuanian community, or an Italian into an Italian community. So just want to give you a sense of the thinking about assimilation. Here is an excerpt from an article by Milton Gordon. The forms and devices of the immigrant community face two ways. On the one hand, providing the indispensable, comfortable milieu, they continue the newcomer's orientation to the culture of the old country and the old locality, to its familiar ways of doing things, to its current history and its current gossip. On the other hand, they gradually incorporate elements of the American culture, interpret that culture to the newcomer in ways which he can understand, and sift its elements and bring them to his attention in a degree and at a pace which muffles and makes bearable the shock of cultural collision. The immigrant's burial and insurance policies, his indigenous church, his foreign language press, his favorite cafes and coffee houses, his old-style theatrical entertainments, his network of social cliques and nationality organizations, his ceremonies and folk dances are never created or recreated simply as replicas of old country elements. They are always progressively reflect the influence of American conditions and American events, serving as a sturdy bridge between the old and the new. In a word, the immigrant sub-society mediates between the native culture of the immigrant and the American culture. Well, isn't that what we're doing here? Okay. So Gordon also writes, the American-born children of immigrants, the second generation, with exceptions based on the existence of a few rigidly enclosed enclaves, should be realistically viewed as a generation irreversibly on its way to virtually complete acculturation, although not necessarily structural assimilation to Native American cultural values at selected class levels. Exposed to the overwhelming acculturative powers of the public school and the mass communications media, the immigrants' children will proffer their unhesitating alliance to those aspects of the American cultural system which are visible to them in their particular portion of the socio-economic structure. So that's really a sociologist's way of saying that let the first generation of immigrants have their native culture in the form of churches and clubs and theaters, foods, restaurants, but the American-born generation will assimilate into American culture. But what's interesting with why is the second wave of immigration out of Lithuania, the displaced persons, was unique in that the displaced persons in creating the North American Lithuanian world community consciously sought to arrest that assimilation into American life by retaining Lithuanian language and heritage and culture. So there were really, the programs of that culture were intended to stop that process of assimilation, to arrest it. How successful or unsuccessful that project is really could be measured on an individual by individual level, but that was the intention of the community. So it's a very interesting thing. But cultural plurality made it possible to comfortably have a dual culture and a dual identity and not be in conflict with American life. So you have two forces coming together. You have this movement of cultural plurality, allowing immigrants to hold on to their home culture and language, really coming into play at the same time that you have displaced persons coming over from Europe, and you have Lithuanians, Latvians, and Estonians who find fertile ground and a comfortable space to be able to continue having their home organizations without any friction really from American society or government. All right, so cultural memory in the Lithuanian diaspora. So Osman's theory of cultural memory contains three interrelated concepts: memory, the contemporized past, culture, and the group, or society. So often there is considerable overlap between these three categories as each functions to uphold the other. At the core of culture and society, expressed through clubs, schools, commemorative events, there is always memory, all right? So here we are in the midst of expressing a cultural and society event, but it is based on our collective memory that we share together. All right. Therefore, if one could imagine three interlocking circles, the middle circle would represent memory, and culture and society would overlap with the other circles. So you see here, so it's memory, culture, society. These three aspects make up cultural memory. So memory, we all share a collective memory. So our children are going to go to Lithuanian school and Lithuanian camp, and they're going to learn Lithuania's history. They're going to share that memory with their parents and grandparents. They're going to participate in cultural events, and they are going to be part of a society, a bendruomenė. So it's very interesting that over in Konstanz, Germany, Jan and Alida Osman, and before that, a sociologist named Maurice Halbwachs, were developing these theories of cultural memory. Okay, so I want to take a look at two memoirs, one by Antana Šileika, the other by Daiva Markelis, that focus on their experience growing up in Cicero and outside of Toronto of cultural memory. And, both of them are born in the 1950s. They're roughly the same age. So World War II and the Soviet occupation of Lithuania brought Daiva Markelis and Antana Šileika's DP parents to North America in the early 1950s. So within this landscape of extreme loss, family and community rituals kept memories of the homeland alive and created a means to pass them down to subsequent generations born and raised in the United States. The diaspora community was essentially a community of survivors of war, many of whom were coping with few resources to to heal from survivor's guilt and displacement. So set in the most populous North American Lithuanian diaspora, Chicago and Toronto, the memoirs Whitefield Black Sheep and Barefoot Bengal Collar reflect cultural memory experiences constructed out of collective trauma experienced by war refugees escaping the Soviet occupation of Lithuania in 1944. These collective trauma memories were shaped into collective memory with the goal of passing on memory, heritage, and culture, and maintaining a cohesive society. Okay. So their narratives are of growing up in a North American Lithuanian communities, but they also function as post-memory narratives and coming-of-age stories. So let's talk about symbols of culture and memory and society. So Markelis describes the many ways she feels displaced while growing up in the city where she was born. Markelis' memoir opens with an experience of negotiating quote-unquote cultural collisions, describing the neighborhood where she grew up. So she writes, "The markers of my childhood, the varnish factory looming like a giant domino against the sooty sky, the rat-infested coal yard north of the Burlington tracks, the air of huge red magic-kissed lips jutting out and above the Eisenhower Expressway. Coming back from summer trips to Indiana, my sister and I would spot them and know we were home. They were a woman's lips curving gracefully at the edges. Set against the gray industrial landscape of northern Cicero, Illinois, they seemed to me heartbreakingly beautiful." There they are, the magic-kissed lips. I don't know, does anybody recognize that? Anybody from Chicago? Have you seen those? Okay.
Are we still there?
I don't think so. Okay, so rather than Lithuanian fir trees or the Baltic Sea or Baroque architecture emerging in her daughter's consciousness as images of home, these symbols of cultural memory are replaced with the provocative lips of a tawdry woman looming over a dirty skyline set against a depressing industrial landscape. With these early visual perceptions lodged in her memory of home, Markelis finds herself in the borderlands between cultures. And she writes, "My mother, however, found them vulgar, symbolic of all the things wrong with this new country: plastic flowers, hostess cupcakes, Barbie dolls. What she found offensive of the magic kiss sign was not only the deliberate and ugly bigness of the lips, but also the provocative misspelling of the word. 'It should be magic kissed, shouldn't it?' she'd say every time we passed the sign. She disliked the loony orthography of American advertising, hated finding the S in E's arrogantly displaced by a Z, as in the over-the-counter sleeping pill Sleep Ease. In our native Lithuania, there's no mechanism for such an easy resettlement of morphemes." Okay, so the symbol of the larger-than-life sexualized woman's lips, which Markelis as a child finds heartbreakingly beautiful, are vulgar to her Lithuanian DP mother. The image that her small daughter associates with home, the mother associates with gaudy, cheap, superficial American culture. For the mother, those lips grimace rather than smile, while the constant reminder of those cheap, gaudy lips hovering on the skyline becomes a symbol of home to the daughter. For the mother, they are a reminder of the home and culture she has lost. But the gaudy American lips also challenge the mother to pass on her own culture to her daughter. So here's another excerpt. "A trip through the Wisconsin countryside would bring back memories of the forests of Lithuania with their birches and pines. My mother would speak of the holiness of trees, their sacred status in Lithuanian culture. The souls of the dead migrate to surrounding oaks and maples," she would say in as matter-of-factly as if she were telling us where the birds go in the winter. So Markelis cannot reconcile her perception of the vulgar lips as beautiful with the cultural references her parents and her Lithuanian American community instill in her. She is asked to honor a country she has never seen, to uphold the cultural standards of a homeland she has never experienced, and to literally not see the one that she was born into. Critic James Morrison calls this state of mind a double consciousness, arguing that Marcalis's memoir is a narrative of displacement. Morrison points out that there is always a double vision at work in the memoir. The daughter's American and urban gaze also contains within it the DP mother's gaze of a pastoral landscape from a lost country that Marcalis has never seen. The disparate images coexist in Marcalis's mind as though one were superimposed onto the other. Okay, so I'm going to speed this up and kind of finish up here. So in his memoir, The Barefoot Bingo Caller, Šileika describes a pep talk given by his Lithuanian folk ensemble's director, Mrs. Aldona, that is meant to instill pride and a sense of dignity in the second-generation Canadian-born Lithuanian youth before an important Lithuanian folk dance performance. This pep talk offers an opportunity for first-generation Mrs. Aldona to instill the values of Lithuanian cultural memory into the Canadian-born teenager. Our dances are quiet, sure, but we have dignity and serenity. People sense that, they respect that, but you have to know how to project dignity. So this dance performance pep talk places a heavy burden on the second-generation Canadian-born teenage dancers. They are expected to pull off staging the dignity of having survived the trauma of war and having escaped and carried on with Lithuanian culture without having themselves experienced those historical events. They are instructed to emulate an aura of serene, innocent victimhood and create a moving performance for a Canadian audience outside of the diaspora cultural memory group. However, as Canadian-born members of that society, the young dancers are keenly aware of how the Canadians will perceive them as quote-unquote happy ethnics, and not in the way Mrs. Aldona wished. This cultural collision becomes painfully apparent at the end of the chapter when Šileika ditches a polka dance contest just as he and his partner are about to win, when he sees an American girl who he had been flirting with a few weeks ago on Yonge Street, and he sees that she's watching him in his folk costume. And he decides there's no contest between a contemporary American girl and a girl living according to a constructed Lithuanian identity. So of course, in the scene, he's referring to his dance partner, Irene, who, as she's putting on her Lithuanian costume, she's smoking a cigarette, and she asks him provocatively, "Oh, how do I look? What do you think?" And he says, "Oh," he scorns at her and says, "You look like a happy peasant." You know, and then the dance troupe leader comes and yells at her for smoking a cigarette while dressed in a Lithuanian costume. But then Antanas Šileika comments on how his mother, who had become really acclimatized to Canadian life, was wearing these stylish pantsuits and had her hair done nicely. And he comments his mother was in camouflage. She learned to look like a Canadian while she was an immigrant at heart. So, so Šileika in his memoir complains that he misses out on the counterculture of the 60s and 70s that marked his generation in North America, but accepts as compensation having some unruly fun with the other ethnics on Dominion Day. He writes, "As for us, we were still on the boat. Even when we got off the boat, the island was filled with other people like us, happy ethnics celebrating their heritage while building a better future together. Other people went to Woodstock. Some had been to Monterey. I was on Center Island." Okay, so although he's born in Canada, Šileika imagines himself as an immigrant on the boat to Ellis Island, and he writes, "I wouldn't have been surprised if our ferry traveled down the St. Lawrence and out to the Atlantic and landed at Ellis Island." Okay, so I see that I've already been talking an hour, so I think I'm just going to very quickly, finish up, because the second part was about Samuel Bach and his memoir, his book Catharsis as Memoir. And I don't know, I think probably you guys are done, right? Okay, so we're just going to move through all of these slides and just get to the conclusions, and we can finish up. Okay. All right, so just to wrap up, there is a sense of belatedness of trauma in these narratives that takes place because of the 50-year-long Soviet occupation of Lithuania, which rendered familial, historical, collective trauma narratives inaccessible for 5 decades, and which separated families, leaving some behind the Iron Curtain and others in the West. In narratives where family secrets and silence surround an ancestor's choices and actions, the resolution of those secrets by the second or third generation writer in some cases brings personal catharsis and post-traumatic growth, while in others remains unresolved. Also present in these works of literature is the ethical imperative that the histories reveal, reframing historical discussion for future generations. These works of literature bring about a sense of knowing, of becoming an expert, of acquiring an insider's view into personal and historical collective trauma. They examine how the family narrative fits within the cultural memory narrative and how closure releases the narrator from the shackles of the past, offering emotional and/or psychological release. These memoirs are not only literary works, but through their narrative intent, become artifacts for future healing, offering the possibility of repair between Christian Lithuanians and Jews, and between members of the second and third generation of the North American Lithuanian diaspora and their contemporaries in an independent democratic Lithuania. So as my final reflection, I would just like to say, my life has been a process of searching for identity, attempting to understand from the distance of time and geography an inheritance that is not mine as a birthright, but that has come to me through the echoes of Lithuanians' collective trauma and family stories. Vanished Lands is the result of years of scholarly work, but also a lifetime of listening to survivors' stories. This book grew out of a need to write about those histories that have been shrouded in silence, a need to reflect on a North American Lithuanian diaspora that has lived with its suppressed ghosts of the Holocaust and with its own hauntings of Soviet Russian occupation, exile to Siberia, the post-war anti-Soviet resistance, and forced immigration abroad. The echoes of those histories are transmitted to future generations through post-memory in a process that warrants our understanding and our compassion. Okay, so thank you, everybody, for listening, and if you can stand it for just a few more minutes, if you have any questions, I would love to hear your questions. And this is actually my grandparents and my mother, Aldona, who's sitting there. She's that cute girl there with the bow in her head, and my late uncle, Julius Simutis. So, okay, so... Thank you. So, questions. Oh, I guess we'll start with Paulius, and then you over there.
Laima, ačiū labai. Thank you very much for this presentation. You mentioned in the beginning that you kind of focused in on 6 Lithuanian diaspora writers, literary examples. Just wanted to ask, how many did you start with before you kind of culled down to those 6, and what was kind of special about those 6 that made you select those?
Yeah, that's, it was a really, really hard choice to find, to decide which ones to focus on, because, I started with many more, but this project started as my doctoral dissertation. And actually, I was supposed to go to Konstanz, Germany, to the study in the Center for Cultural Memory at that time, but the pandemic did not allow me to do that. But I was able to communicate with a professor there and send my work. And actually, it was that professor who really suggested to me that the work is so broad and there's so much to talk about that I should focus on memoir. And so the memoirs that I've worked with, Samuel Bach's Painted in Words, and personally I love that book. It's a very, it's just the way, I guess because I'm also a visual artist, the way that book is written so visually, and it's written with so much compassion and humor, that I chose his book as one of the first generation books. And then I looked at 2 memoirs by granddaughters of perpetrators. So that would be Rita Gabis, The Guest at the Shooter's Banquet, and Yulia Shukis, who was here a few years ago, Siberian exile. I thought that Andana Shileika and Daiva Margalis, because both of them use humor and a sense of absurd to kind of highlight the disparate sense of disassociation between having an American or Canadian life and a Lithuanian life. And their memoirs are really go into great detail about the cultural memory experience. And then I also pulled in Ellen Cassidy's memoir, We Are Here, because she is, part of her heritage is Litvak, and she goes back to Lithuania on a right of return journey to research her Jewish roots and also to learn Yiddish, and so it's about her experiences. I did actually also include a chapter on Algirdas Landsbergis's play, Seven Posts in the Marketplace. I guess that's the one exception, but I thought it was a very interesting play because it's his, first generation, kind of like secondary trauma experience of the anti-Soviet post-war resistance. So, I don't know, there's so many good books out there, it would be really hard to choose, but that was, thematically where I ended up. So, and a lot of times when you're working on a book like this, I know Yulia Shukis read the book and gave me a lot of good advice while I was working on it, and of course Saulius Sužėdelis wrote the foreword to the book and also, gave me very good advice. So, you do rely on other writers and their input, and sometimes when, somebody says, oh, you should include this, you should take that out, sometimes that really helps to make that final decision. But with a project like this, you could just keep going forever. Yeah, and you had a question in the back?
Let me have, first one simple comment, on maps. I was, when you mentioned that, Lithuania, the Soviets had no or the maps that were created by America had no distinctions of the Baltic countries. And that actually changed I believe in the 70s when the Lithuanian American community got involved, and they actually forced the State Department to make changes. And that slowly began a trend. So I just want to make that, even though I agreed with you in the beginning, there was a process of change that was driven by the diaspora that was actually had its roots in Ateitininkai, and I want to relate to what Ateitininkai are. Because I'm trying to, there's a lot you've said, and to internalize all is difficult.
Yeah.
But I wanted to say this, that I felt all the pressures that you mentioned as we grew up. However, I never felt any of the trauma. So the trauma
you're
to me
lucky.
is, I can't, that's difficult for me. Now, there's trauma that that the children of criminals will always have when they discover their parents' criminal past. That's unavoidable. But those who whose parents weren't aware of it, may not have the trauma.
Yeah, well, that's very true because it's really highly individual, and that's certainly true. And maybe what motivates writers to write their memoirs because they've had, on some level, some sort of traumatic experience that they wish to work through in their writing. Regarding the maps, I have to tell you, my children grew up on Peaks Island, Maine, and even in 2006, I remember in my daughter's classroom when we pulled down the map, it was still the old map without Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia being delineated. They were still part of this USSR, so it's really wonderful that the work that was done to change that, but the reality is that maybe outside of the cities, those old maps were in classrooms everywhere, and people were still being exposed to them.
So that had its impact. I'll just, if I could just extend that, because it's an Ateitininkai week, so it's a little bit different. Ateitininkai were driven by their 5 principles. Man lietuviškai gal lengviau pasakyti. Yra 5 principai. Ir net, kai mes važiavom į kursus, tas, kas buvo, mes tai buvom verti, tu būk lietuvis, tu šitais principais bandyk gyventi. Ir aš labai atsimenu kunigą Ilą, aš važiavau į tuos moksleivių kursus, kai aš buvau 16-17 metų. And the guy, kai jis pasakė, jūs būsit Lietuvos shock troops. Jis tą vardoja žodį, shock troops, so the accent, shock troops būsite. Ir ką jis turėjo minty, išmoksite principus, pagal kuriuos ateis laikas, tie principai bus svarbu. Ir aš to, apart tavo jau yra bendras kultūrinis prisitaikymas arba kultūrinės atminties poveikis, bet aš manau yra skirtumų ir kur organizacijos, kur spaudė, principinę, mokymo teorijas ir išsilavimą, gal tą dar reikėtų paryškinti.
Yeah, except this is not a book about ateitininkai. It's really a book, it's a much broader subject. And incidentally, I actually quote extensively from Kunigas Ila's memoir of his time in Stutthof in this book. So he really, I do incorporate his sense. But this was not a ateitininkai book, so I hear and respect what you're saying about the 5 principles and ateitininkai, but this is a broader context.
So just one kind of general comment. I think a lot of the books that have been written, there's not that much that talks about the trauma and everything that happened in the DP camps. I mean, there was physical trauma, there was other trauma, but there was also the not knowing, like when people had to scurry to go from the British zone or the French zone to the American zone if they didn't want to get sent back. What about all the Poles who were committing suicide, jumping in front of trains so they wouldn't, so they wouldn't have to go back? So, and I think that there's also not as much explored about the choices people faced, right? So you could go to the US, A, if you had a sponsor, and B, if you passed the health test, right? You could only go to Canada if you indentured yourself. 1 year for women, 2 years for men, especially if they're going to go
Same for Australia as well.
And Australia, they were looking for mostly men to work in the mines and stuff. So I think that piece of it also, the trauma that had to happen there, the decisions that people had to make, like with little or no information and no internet and no nothing. I think that whole piece of it was kind of scary as well.
Well, that's why actually it takes me all the way until chapter 6 to get into the literature, because I do have several chapters that set up and explore these themes. So, for example, 19th and 20th century migration from Lithuania to North America, the role of Lithuanian emigre writers in shaping the next generation. So the book does go into that history. So it's really, because you can't talk about the literature without setting it up. I do want to say though, that there's a wonderful Latvian DP writer, I'm forgetting her first name, but her last name is Nesauna, who wrote her a very, very daring memoir of ending up trapped in the Russian zone in Germany and experiencing rapes in the makeshift DP camps there, and which is a very, very tragic book. And so there are some, Latvian books that explore this darker side, and really it would be great to kind of look at like Latvian and Lithuanian and Estonian literature and those themes. But there's always more to write, and I really would encourage all of you to write down your family stories and to interview and collect as much as you can. Yeah, Woman in Amber. Yeah, Agate. Yeah, Agate Nesaule. Yeah.